Okay, looks like we are set for our last session. It feels like 6 sessions all wrapped into one with the case studies. But I see people are starting to jump right into the session. I'm just going to give you a little explanation for those watching how this is going to work. So if you're wondering how do we fit all this in, each case study is going to be a maximum of 20 minutes. And so I've got a clock, I've got a stopwatch timer right here on my iPhone. That'll be sort of the tool. I know some of our presenters are doing the same thing. And it's really just to kind of keep the pace moving, because I know any of these case studies could probably take 30 minutes, 40 minutes, an hour, but we're trying to keep them a little bit, a little sharper, a little punchy, and creates more desire for you to reach out to some of the speakers, and maybe learn more about the case study. So if I have to, you might hear me jump in and give a brief, hey, we've got 1 minute or we have 2 minutes, just to let the speakers know. And when in doubt, I might have to cut somebody off and just mute them. So hopefully that won't happen. With that, we will be taking questions at the end. We will try to. And since this is the last session of the day, we've got the opportunity to maybe stick around a little bit longer. So if you have questions, you can put them in the chat and or wait until the very end, and then certainly pose those questions at that time. So with that, our first case study is Ada County's Hidden Gem. Persevering, Celebrating, and Reconnecting Expo, Idaho. I hope I didn't butcher that too much, Sarah. Sarah Sieloff with Maul, Alongi. She's going to take it from here. And with that, thank you for sharing.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much, Greg. It's a pleasure to be with everybody today. Can everybody see my screen? Okay.
Looks good. Yeah.
Great.
Good.
Okay. Excellent. So let's do this. Sarah Sieloff. Before I joined Maul, I spent about a year plus in Japan researching shrinking cities. And before that, I spent 5 years as the executive director of the Center for Creative Land Recycling, where I got to work with many Idaho communities and fabulous IDEQ staff like Steve Gill and Eric Trainer and the gang. So good to be with you today. And what I'm going to talk about is the redevelopment or at least the redevelopment process to date for Expo, Idaho, which is a large site in Ada County, which is the home of Boise. This is going to be a little different from some other brownfield stories that we're going to talk about today, in that there's not really a contamination component. What there is a big redevelopment component. And as brownfielders, I think we all know that when you deal with the contamination, you're really only half done, right? That the other half is figuring out, especially with big, complex, multi-phase projects, how to make them happen. And so that's what I'm going to talk about today. Let me click. There we go. Okay. So this is where we're going to go. And I want to start off by just talking about the first question, what's a ULI advisory services panel? Because that's how I came to be able to study the redevelopment of Expo, Idaho. And so ULI, as many will know, is the Urban Land Institute. It's a global network of land use professionals throughout the world, and ULI does a lot of stuff. It organizes conferences. In fact, the head of ULI Idaho could not be with us today because she's in San Diego helping with one of the big annual conferences. They also conduct research and they offer technical assistance. And one of the big ways that they conduct their technical assistance is through these advisory services panels. And for a redevelopment project, this is really great because it brings together 6 to 8 people from different fields from all across the US. And you focus on one place and one set of questions that have been posed by whoever is hosting. A local government is often the host. So I'm going to go through what we were advising on and why and where we ended up and what we can all learn from this. And I had the pleasure of, let's see, this panel was in June of 2021. I had the pleasure of chairing the panel. And I've had the pleasure of doing that in a number of places around the US, from Puerto Rico to Colorado. But working on Expo, Idaho was really, really interesting because there just is so much opportunity. So let's dig in. So this is an aerial shot of Expo, Idaho and the surrounding areas. You can see that little red balloon is the Expo, Idaho site. It is an island of county-owned land in Garden City, which is a suburb just north of Boise. And you can see that there's a lot of development in and around Expo, Idaho. And as most people know, the Boise area is one of the fastest growing metro areas in the country. So this makes things doubly interesting, right? So here's a zoom in of the and zoomed in view of Expo, Idaho. So it's a big site. First of all, it's 247 acres. It's pretty centrally located within the Treasure Valley. And it has this long history of serving a lot of different uses for many different communities, everything from quinceañeras to car shows and the Western Idaho Fair and concerts, right? It's also the site of the Boise Hawks baseball stadium. That's a local minor league baseball team. And there was a racetrack. So funny thing, there had been a conversation for a while about redevelopment of Expo, Idaho. And in 2018, it's actually the horse track that pushes things over the edge and kickstarts this new level of thinking about the redevelopment process. And what happens is that the Idaho State Legislature passes a law that effectively ends horse racing at the site. It outlaws something called historical wagers, betting on past horse races, and that means that horse racing is no longer profitable at this site. So 60 acres of this 247-acre site are now up for grabs, and all of a sudden, redevelopment kind of comes onto the scene in a new way. So the Ada County Commission appoints a Citizens Advisory Committee in 2020, right? We all know what happens next. This group bravely meets through the most uncertain and often scariest moments of the pandemic. And in the course of a year, it produces 3 different community-informed potential redevelopment visions for Expo, Idaho. So I'm going to run through those really quickly, and then we're going to really get into the meat of what our ULI panel was about and what it can teach us. So development direction number 1, right? This is the Community Advisory Committee, based on lots of interviews with different people around the Treasure Valley, proposes this agricultural heritage and outdoor education campus. This effectively argues for keeping the site pretty much as it is now in terms of its focus and its function, right? Really celebrating the area's agricultural heritage, but also maybe building in and expanding some natural space. So one of the really interesting things, and you can see it in the image on this screen, it's a little faint, is that the Boise River actually runs along the northeastern side of Expo, Idaho. So 247 acres adjacent to the river. You've got the much loved regional Greenbelt Trail that runs along that river too. And so there's legitimately a lot of good that you could do in terms of expanding green space and really drawing on that riverine environment. And interestingly, in our research, in our panel's research, what we heard repeatedly from members of the community was, we need more green space, we want more green space. So this answers that. Community Advisory Committee comes up with this option as well. This is sports events and a recreation complex. So again, a big focus on green space, but not necessarily natural green space or raw green space. It's maybe more programmed sports fields, right? That was another thing we heard from the community. Our kids don't have places to play sports, right? We need more places to play ball. And of course, there's some interesting economic development opportunities that come with this, maybe for youth sports tournaments. And it would play off nicely the existence of the Boise Hawks Stadium, which you can see here on the western side of the image on the screen. So the third option that the Community Advisory Committee comes up with is this model for a Garden City Town Center. And effectively, when Garden City first developed, it was just that, it was gardens, right? There was a large Chinese community, a community of Chinese immigrants who were growing a lot of vegetables that would be sold in Boise, and Garden City, true to its name, was where that happened. So when Garden City developed mid-century, there wasn't a lot of planning that really gave it a proper center. And so this was seen, this redevelopment of Expo, Idaho was seen as and a great opportunity to go back and give that to Garden City and incorporate some nature trails and, keep Expo Idaho on the site, keep it as an event center, but really put in some housing and some commercial space. And so here comes the panel, right? So I mentioned in walk the 8 of us, and we have developers, we have finance experts, we've got the manager of the LA County Fairgrounds. And this is our assignment. We are supposed to perform an economic feasibility analysis of those 3 scenarios I just showed you that were developed with a lot of community input in 2020. And we're supposed to bear in mind existing constraints and offer some recommendations for citizen engagement. So we did that in the course of 4 days online. And this, so again, 4 days, 8 people, we conducted 54 interviews with people all around the community, and we used the best available information to make what we felt were credible estimates. So what did we find? Here we go. Estimated cost of the 3 scenarios. I'm not going to go through this in great detail, but I think as you can see, the big takeaway here is that no matter what option you're talking about, it's going to cost money, right? 80 to $200 million would be the full range. And that's no small chunk of change, right? So that's what it's going to take you to get to any one of those three options that the Community Advisory Committee raised. But in our research, what we found was that, these were all great ideas. It was really difficult based on what we were hearing from the community about different needs. It was really difficult to justify choosing between these. And so what the panel did was it said, all of these can happen at the same time on this site, right? 247 acres is a lot of land. And so this is where we really shift gears into kind of thinking about the redevelopment process and how are we going to get from A to B, right? Same question that we're all asking ourselves about a lot of brownfields projects. And we really stressed to the county commission and to members of the community that this is about thinking in terms of and, not or. And then in terms of capital investment, everything is going to require capital investment, and doing nothing is also going to require capital investment. So really, given the age of the buildings and the needs of the community and how the community has grown and its needs have diversified, now is an ideal opportunity to be able to take these generational steps to build an Expo Idaho that can continue to serve the grandchildren of today's Treasure Valley residents, right? And continue to be that great community gathering place. I also wanted to highlight, and we're going to come back to this later, that this is a really interesting site, not only because it's big and because it's surrounded by all of this growth, but also because the county was in the process of reconsidering its floodplains. And so you can see the violet line on the image at the right of the screen indicates the existing floodplain. The magenta line, kind of the reddish line, indicates the proposed floodplain. So that's a really significant expansion, right? And floodplains, can be negotiated, but the point is that this was going to have the existence of a floodplain that covers that much of the site is also going to have a big impact on how the site can get redeveloped. And so this is one of those constraints that we were told to take into consideration. And so we did so. I'm going to get to what exactly we proposed, but I want to talk about how we got there. So hearing from the community, we really tried to couch our recommendations in through the lens of 4 different key terms, right? And that was preserve, celebrate, connect, and think big. Preserve, clearly, everybody wants to preserve green space. We're really fortunate to be working with this site that is right up against the Boise River Greenbelt, gives us great opportunities to be able to leverage existing open space and green space there. There's a big history at this site, right? There's a lot of history for the region. The region comes together at Expo Idaho for lots of reasons to celebrate lots of things, right? Sports, events, the fair. And at the same time, the community is growing, it's diversifying, and Expo Idaho and redeveloping Expo Idaho to meet those more diverse needs really does offer an opportunity to connect with the community and connect different parts of the community in new ways. And then finally, thinking big, right? In terms of public benefit that can be provided, but also just in terms of what this means for asset management. This was a big message in our recommendations to Ada County, that we thought that this site was such a gem and that it had so much going for it and so much potential that it really was worth the investment, and that with some careful planning, you would be able to increase and optimize utilization, and that would have knock-on benefits both economically for businesses, but also in terms of building social capital and continuing to raise quality of life raise and preserve quality of life in the Treasure Valley. So in terms of process, right, there were a lot of questions about, well, how are we going to get there, right? Regardless of what happens and when we put shovels in the ground, how are we going to go from A to B? And this was where we really dug in on approach, right? And we argued that the strategic steps that Ada County could take in the next 18 months, so from June 2021 to the end of this year, could help create that generational opportunity, right? And in those strategic next steps, we saw a role for planning, right? You got to know where you're headed. We also saw a role for governance, right? Thinking really carefully. And I think this is a great lesson for any large redevelopment project about how are you going to election-proof this project, right? Keep it on track. Grow local champions, but also set up a governance structure that is going to really help support the continued execution of whatever plans you make in step 1. Communicating, And that means bringing the public along, right? And especially, communicating to the public that this could be a 10 to 35-year project, depending on how you phase different parts and whether they're simultaneous or sequential. And then finally, developing a resource roadmap we thought was really key, right? You've got to know where you're going to find the money and how you're going to pay for things in subsequent phases. You don't have to know it all up front, but you can at least start. I'm going to dig into that a little bit later. Okay. Here we go. So here's what we actually recommended. This was option 4 for us, and this was an original creation of the panel. And so you can see that this really combines elements from all 3 of the community advisory committee's scenarios that I presented earlier. So what I want to draw your attention to particularly is that red piece on the left of the screen. So that we thought you could put the town center there. Effectively right now, there's a park called Lady Bird Park. It sits at the intersection of 2 of the busiest roads in Ada County, maybe 2 of the busiest in Idaho. And if there's a desire for a town center, we felt like you could fit that in and really do some creative financing, whether you're selling land to a developer or doing a long-term land lease, to be able to help underwrite redevelopment of the rest of the site. So that was really key, right? Was move Lady Bird Park from what is now red. And you can see that Lady Bird Park in our rendering moves to the east side of the park, right up not coincidentally, against the Boise River and that green belt. And you can see that from the developed built up area, which is closest to the busy roads, right, really accessible to traffic, you've got these green arrows, which serve as a midway for the fair, but also green space when the fair is not happening, which is 50 weeks out of the year, right? Leading to Lady Bird Park. You could move the baseball stadium if you wanted to. We accounted for that. And we also left the Expo buildings in. So you've got this kind of commercial core that, you know, has some green space all around it. There are some ball fields as well that really snuggle up against that wild green space. And those can be within the floodplain, right? And they can act as a sponge if they need to. And then finally, there's a water feature and a nature center down at the bottom, kind of more structured outdoor wetland, good for educational purposes, raising and educating about fishing, whatever it is that you might need. So this is what we presented, and we said, we think that you can do this. You can accommodate a lot of different visions for this site, and we think that we can get it to all fit together. Now, the total cost that we estimated for this was $172 million. Now, that is enough to make your breath kind of catch in your throat, right? But here's the thing about funding opportunities and thinking about a resource roadmap. And we were really lucky to have the economic development director of Sandy City, Utah on our team. Now, it turns out that Jeff had built a stadium for Real Salt Lake, right? The soccer team out of the Salt Lake City metro area. So he was had this project fresh in mind, and he was able to basically tell us tricks of the trade for how he had managed to make such a gigantic redevelopment project really pencil. And as you can see here, state and federal grants are number 4 on the list. This is not rank ordered or anything, but they're there. We talk a lot about grants. Those are critical. That is critical catalytic funding. I'm a big fan, but we also talk about different models that you can use, especially things like revenue sharing, right? Maybe use of an urban renewal agency, something like naming rights and sponsorship, tournament fees, if you're going to have those ballparks, right? How do you, basically the question was, if we understand that public benefit comes from use of the site and downtime is the enemy of public benefit, how can we think about building a space that is going to be full and used by people more often than not? And then we can capitalize on that activity in different ways to think about how to build that resource roadmap and fund this project. Now, there's a lot of writing on this slide, and it's too small to read, but I do have a link at the end of the presentation if you want to see the full ULI report, because every advisory service panel comes with a report, and so you can really dig into the details there if you're curious. But this was a phasing summary table that we put together to really illustrate, okay, well, you got the vision, you got the money, how are you actually going to do it? And we ran through 5 different phases, some of which, as you can see in phase 2A and 2B, you could conduct simultaneously or maybe sequentially, really just depends on the financing and the political will and where things are at. But effectively, we're moving again through what I mentioned earlier as those key, we start with the first 18 months, right? Or first in this diagram, like the first 12 months, right? The market studies, making decisions about the floodplain, thinking ahead about those long-term revenue sources, beginning to lay the foundations of that revenue roadmap. And then we get on to different, from floodplain implementation to moving Lady Bird Park, improving Expo facilities in phase 2B, finalizing master plans, and then more construction in phases 4 and 5. The long story short, and what we really tried to highlight here was, look, this is going to take time. And how do you eat the elephant? You eat it one bite at a time. And here is a model for what that could look like in terms of managing a complex redevelopment project that is also going to deliver really phenomenal benefits to the community. So key takeaways, just want to leave you with this. And I think this is, these are good lessons for any redevelopment project. More brains, more benefit, right? What made this team so strong and what I love about these ULI advisory service panels, and if you're curious, talk to me afterward, I'm more than happy to chat about ULI, is that you get to work with people from different fields and you communicate, and that brings a lot of value to the project, right? The developers were seeing something that the finance people might not be seeing, and vice versa. And our local economic development expert from Sandy City, Utah saw something totally different. Communication along the way and throughout is really critical for creating alignment and realistic expectations and maintaining public support. Thinking in stages and phases is key. Also, is it a limitation or is it an invitation? And this is where I think leveraging the floodplain to create that green space everybody said they wanted is really significant. The plan that we proposed more than quintupled green space on the site. Existing green space is 20 acres. Our plan proposed about 101, a mix between open space and sports fields. We talked about that resource roadmap, and then finally thinking big and thinking about legacy, right? Generating optimal benefits and making sure that a site is flexible, but also future-proof, that it's flexible enough to be able to continue to meet the needs of the community as you move forward. And the final thing I'll say is that the Ada County passed an ordinance to initiate the process to move Lady Bird Park from one side of Expo, Idaho to the other. So we were super excited to hear that in the fall. And they're going to be demolishing the old horse stables. So stay tuned. It's worth keeping an eye on Expo, Idaho. And thanks very much, Greg. Back to you.
Hey, Sarah, nice job. That was great. You would be the first one out of the gate with presenting. So I really appreciate that. So next up, we have John Munkers with Alta Science and Engineering on the city of Moscow. There you are, John.
Hello, thanks, Greg.
I'm ready to go whenever you are.
Right. Share my screen here.
Looks good.
All right, well, thank you, Greg. And thanks to everyone at NEBC too, and Jennifer, Rachel, everyone that helped put this on. Appreciate the opportunity to talk about Brownfields today. My name is John Munkers. I'm one of the founding principals here at Alta Science and Engineering. And I'm going to talk a little bit about Brownfields projects in Moscow. Let's see if I can. All right. So most of this work, I'm going to focus on probably the technical environmental process work that was completed for these projects. So most of the funding came through EPA grant to the Greater Moscow Brownfields Coalition. That coalition is made up of the city of Moscow, the Moscow Urban Renewal Agency, and Latah County. As we all know, the funding is often a patchwork quilt. And so DEQ did provide funding and support on a number of these projects as well. So rather than talk about one site, this is kind of a six for the price of one kind of presentation here. And the thought being that being able to pull some nuggets or some lessons learned from these different sites that were all assessed as part of this program. So the sites were the Dumas Seed Site. It's an old seed facility, mostly surrounded by residential property, as well as the rail line spur off of that. The Pontiac dealership, which is located close to downtown there, that's now known as the Cannon Press property or Tribble property. A lot of these have different names depending on how far you go back to the ownership history. Sharp Oil's an old bulk dispensary right as you come into town on the south end of town as you enter the University of Idaho. And then the Fountain property is an old ag runway property in the south end of town as well. And then 6th and Jackson is located right next to some grain silos, has a history of fertilizer at that site. So we'll talk a little bit about each one of those sites. So they all started with a phase one. And early in my career, ironically, there was a property in Moscow that I just caught the tail end of that was kind of the lessons of why you do a phase one. And that was Sweet Avenue. Some of you may remember this property, but the University of Idaho was looking to purchase the property that was kind of on the southeastern part of campus. They were looking to spend, I think, well over $1 million. One of their facilities, people had just recently been to a workshop like this that was talking about environmental liability and the reason that you do phase ones and the importance of that. And so they said, we should do a phase one on that property before we spend $1 million. And they did. Some of the interviews, some of the history that was found uncovered that there was a pretty large petroleum release on that property quite a few years ago. And so it ended up being quite the remediation project where the university took on the remediation, spent well over $1 million on the cleanup to clean up the petroleum. It's now the entrance to the university. It's mostly a parking lot and green space. But the takeaway was, the spending a couple $1,000s on a phase one environmental site assessment was a good deal for them because I think they ended up spending $1 for the property. So we did something similar on those 6 properties. They all received phase one environmental site assessments that help facilitate with land transfer. Just to remember for those folks that aren't familiar with phase ones, the shelf life on those. So there's some updates that need to be done along the way to document the progress that's being made. And I guess some advice is you get what you pay for. So it's worth a little bit of extra money to spend the effort to dig into the history as part of the planning effort when you're dealing with those environmental issues for the phase one. So all these sites received phase two site assessments after the phase one was completed, and we looked at gathering data, whether that's soil, groundwater, vapor, indoor air data. And you need a blueprint in order to go out and make sure that the data that you're collecting is defensible and that you're able to make the decisions that you want to make with the data. And so the quality assurance project plan, the QAP or the SAP, is that blueprint. And all of those had slightly different blueprints depending on what kind of contaminants and what history there were, the fertilizers, nutrients, gasoline, heavy oils, pesticides, herbicides, metals. So it's really laying out the detail and the blueprint for collecting that data so that you can make the decisions that you want to make. So going into the phase two, here's some examples of some of the assessment work that was completed. This side on the left is the Dumas seed property that used incremental sampling. So part of this is balancing the finances, the budget, to the amount of data that you can gather. So incremental sampling is a way potentially to get information about a larger area, taking a bunch of little samples and analyzing composites. So that was done at Dumas seed. Sometimes you need to put in groundwater monitoring wells. That's an example of that middle photograph of the auger rig, taking soil samples with a direct push drill rig. That's Alta's direct push drill rig. And those are what the cores look like when they come out of the ground to be able to, identify potential contamination in the subsurface. So what everybody hopes for after you go through that process is you don't find anything, or if there isn't any environmental challenges. That doesn't happen very often, but it did on one of the sites. And that talks about the perception of sites too. Sometimes there's perceptions that things are contaminated, and in reality, maybe they aren't really that contaminated. And so you're able to overcome some of those perceptions with that. But 5 of the other sites did have issues. And just, I think, another thing to consider is the iterative process that this takes too, is that very rarely is it a one and done kind of assessment. Usually there's some questions that pop up after the first round of characterization. And so going back in and focusing in on those areas that where there's data gaps or where are most critical to the redevelopment or the cleanup of the site. So it's balancing that that cost and benefit to make the decisions for cleanup and redevelopment. And a big part of this is just evaluating risk. Idaho's set up really well to be able to look at risk when you're looking at cleanup and options. So what's the future proposed site going to be? Is there going to be children there that are going to be, or a high risk population that you need to really be protective? But not every site's like that. And some sites are just going to be a parking lot. And there's been some projects that I've seen where there's been significant excavations and money spent where maybe using risk-based cleanup strategies would have saved a lot more money and achieved the same end use goal. So then once we've collected the data, once we've evaluated the risk, then it's, what are the options for cleanup? And that's the analysis of Brownfield's cleanup alternatives. So do you dig you haul it away, dig it up, haul it away? Do we treat it in place? Do we create barriers? And this picture here is kind of one of the interesting projects that we did that this is 6th and Jackson, where there was a nutrient issue, but we partnered up and collaborated with another project that was happening at the same time. So I don't know if Josh Cannonberg is on the line here with GPI, but Josh had a petroleum cleanup project that was happening at the same time. And so nutrient-rich soils would really benefit the degradation of those petroleum products. So we were able to team up, coordinate both of those sites, different owners, different sites, and permit a land farm that we could take the nutrient-rich soils, the hot spots within 6th and Jackson, and use those to supplement the petroleum contaminated soils in the land farm and help facilitate and stimulate that biodegradation through the land farming process. So over 20 years, there hasn't been many projects that have been able to collaborate like this. So I thought this was a really unique opportunity. So it's that flexibility and always looking for creative solutions. What this allowed both projects and both sites to do is save money, also have more effective outcomes. And for 6th and Jackson, it allowed the excavation to occur because the haul was less than 10 minutes away, whereas otherwise the haul costs would have been prohibitive to probably do an excavation like that. So anyway, that was a unique story, I think, that really speaks to kind of the collaborative nature of Brownfields and always looking for opportunities to work together. A couple of these projects ended up entering into the voluntary cleanup program, which I wanted to speak to because of the benefits of the flexibility. I think it was Joelle that talked about flexibility in one of the first sections for Brownfields. And the VCP program really does offer that opportunity to use site-specific risk-based cleanup criteria, activity and land use limitations as part of environmental covenants. And then at the end, you get a covenant not to sue from DEQ, which is about as good as you're going to get compared to other state agencies. So it really provides the certainty that developers are looking for, and it provides the flexibility for the owner to be behind the wheel and making decisions about how things are cleaned up, and kind of dovetail that with the future land use, the wants or the needs for future land use. Sharp Oil is a good example of that, where the historic petroleum bulk plant had been a service station as well. There had been a historic cleanup there, not super well documented. It would happen quite a while ago. And so part of this was assessing, what remained there, what issues there were in the soil, the groundwater, potential vapor pathways. So you can see we're taking some soil borings there. And then working with the developer and what they want to do on the site. So this is student housing, or a partial residential development for students right across from the university entrance here. So how do you put the footprint of that development and work alongside the environmental challenges that are here. Some of the environmental issues weren't that bad, but they weren't acceptable for some residential use on parts of the property. So they were able to use risk strategies along with environmental covenants to address those and do it early in the process so the developer could design and incorporate those into the layout of the land use that they're looking for. We had all the data to support it. We looked at the environmental covenant was one of the tools that set aside parts of the property that were appropriate for residential development, others that weren't. There was also planning and contingencies in place so that as infrastructure was being put in, whether it's power or water, sewer, whatever it might be, that if there was residual contamination that was encountered, it gave you a blueprint and a map of what to do and how to handle that. Luckily, there wasn't a lot of that happened. And then also to kind of sweeten the pot a little bit, the Urban Renewal District had incentives to the developer that said, hey, okay, if you do encounter remediation or need to do remediation, one of the tools they were using was a long-term reimbursement agreement. So ability to help offset some of those costs potentially if they were there. Luckily, I think there wasn't really a need to do that because there wasn't the need to do a large remediation effort on this property. So in the end, that's what got built is student housing right across from the entrance to the university. Identity development. So some of the summaries or some of the nuggets that came out of this project, kind of looking back on it, was, sometimes contamination is perceived, and you need to do the due diligence and collect the data to be able to support and show folks that things are okay to move forward with development. Sometimes, assessment means that the cleanup's really not that big a deal. You can address it as part of the development. Others take risk assessment strategies and integrating those into the development early in order to kind of balance the cost and make projects pencil for the developer, as well as protecting human health and the environment. And some sites like 6th and Jackson, we did removals, injections, pump and treat systems, and we're almost there. Some sites just take a little bit longer to address. Unfortunately, there's not endless pot of money in order to dig up everything at every single site. So just knowing that could be the case and planning your timelines accordingly. So in the end, I was talking with Elisa Anderson on these, and there's been tons of development occur in the city of Moscow, probably over $20 million worth of investment as a result of some of these projects. If you drive through downtown, it's changed a lot in the last 10 years in terms of some of these abandoned or old facilities are now being redeveloped. Dumas Seat is now a residential apartment complex. There's student housing, commercial uses, there's a business park. Part of the spur line got developed into a park. So, and these are all things that the community said they wanted and needed in terms of housing and commercial space. So overall, I think a huge success with a little bit of Brownfields funding to jumpstart the redevelopment in the city of Moscow. A lot of partners, EPA, DEQ, the city of Moscow, Urban Renewal Agency as well. Just want to recognize that it is a collaborative effort for sure to see these projects be successful. And with that, I'll leave my contact information. I want to thank NABC again and all the sponsors and the folks and people that helped put this workshop together.
Well done, John. You defer that time to somebody else for hold that back for some other purpose.
Yeah, I plan to be done a little early, so hopefully that works out and gives some, gets us either keeps us on time or maybe a chance for some questions.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we'll hold it, definitely hold its questions, but I see we got it from Brett Zimmerman. Thank you, John. So with that, we'll go to the third case study. And you see it right here, Idaho Falls, redevelopment and planning. Kerry and Ryan, I'm not sure who's going first, but I will reset the timer, but go ahead and take it from here.
Oh, and I'll set my timer. So I'm Ryan Gibbons and I work for Stantec. I'm a land use planner and an urban designer. And then I'm here with my friend at the city, Kerry. So we're going to co-facilitate this little case study. So what I'm going to talk to you about today is the redevelopment planning that we did as part of the City of Idaho Falls EPA Brownfield grant. One of the strongest strategies we can do when, addressing brownfields, redevelopment, and reuse is to come up with a vision and action plan and really engaging with your community members to kind of define their local priorities. So then you have more kind of a path forward in order to address brownfields. So I'm going to start out with just kind of explaining the place. Downtown Idaho Falls is experiencing a lot of revitalization, but at the same time, the region is experiencing massive population growth. So through the city's EPA Brownfield project, the stakeholders defined this focus area, which is delineated in red. So it's this 280 acre area, just kind of northeast of downtown area. And there's all these great neighborhoods, great, legacy walkable neighborhoods to the south. Again, I was saying how downtown is revitalizing, but this area has really kind of experienced kind of a stagnation, over the years. So we wanted to do a little bit of more of a detailed analysis of what really could be done here to kind of rediscover the place. And also within the focus area, there's kind of two main corridors, and they each have their own personality. You have Northgate Mile, which used to be the main drag to Yellowstone. So it has a lot of this 1950s era kind of buildings. But then First Street is more kind of your, it's like a traditional shopping street. And then you have neighborhoods that kind of radiate from that. But then you have some large super blocks that have a lot of redevelopment potential, in the future. Here's some images of kind of the flavor that's in the focus area. So you have these, vintage style buildings that are reminiscent from that 1950s kind of car culture with a lot of neon lights. You're seeing a lot of kind of creative businesses move in. So you can see that there's like some art and creative businesses there, a lot of adaptive reuse. And then you have some civic uses in there. But at the same time, there's a lot of underutilization that's occurring within the focus area, especially along Northgate Mile. It's really turned into more of an auto-centric type of an area. You have a lot of car lots and fast food joints, which is fine, but you also see a lot of kind of vacant sites, sites that really could absorb some of that future population that the region is experiencing. Then you also have some buildings that, over the years they've been kind of added on. So it's kind of taken away from their original kind of architectural style through there. But, we really found that there was kind of a rediscovery of this area of the city as we talked to stakeholders. So when we talk about revitalization, it's a really big lift. It takes a long time to do that. But the idea of brownfields further complicates everything. So I kind of wanted to put it into kind of context. So when we think about existing buildings, a lot of times we'll go in old neighborhoods like, oh, that's a neat old building. Why doesn't somebody go in there? Another thing is that a lot of times if you're a new business startup, you focus on existing buildings. So if you want to open up, I don't know, a tea shop or something, you're not going to build a new building. You're going to try to reoccupy, an older building. But a lot of times those older buildings have things like lead-based paint, has asbestos, molds, those type of things that sometimes it can kind of hit you by surprise when you want to do your tenant improvements. So it's a really good idea to work with property owners to identify those hazardous building materials even at the beginning, so then you can reoccupy those spaces. Similarly with vacant property, a lot of times people are really scared to take on these vacant properties that are in an urban context because there's just so many unknowns. That's why you see so many people kind of passing over vacant sites in an urban context and just go out to urban fringe. So, and that contributes to urban sprawl. But if we can get ahead of this, then we can lay down kind of an action plan on how to re-tenant buildings or to redevelop vacant sites. And if we don't do anything with these sites, and if we don't help them out, you know, it just leads to neighborhood blight and further abandonment. And then it's just, you know, a long-term effect on human and environmental health. But luckily, the EPA and also some state departments have some incentive programs to help deal directly with brownfields. For example, Idaho Falls, they received a $600,000 EPA brownfield grant that lasted about 3 years. They did get an extension. They chose to prioritize a lot of the grant funds and activities in the city of Idaho Falls itself, but you know, the urban area within the county was also eligible for some of those funds. I really love this program whenever you talk about revitalization because it gives you so many tools and there's so much flexibility. Here's a couple of the eligible activities you can do under the EPA brownfield grants and similar state grants. Is that you can do a property inventory by using readily available information. You can do more of a GIS exercise to identify where those probable brownfields are. So then you can kind of see where there's a cluster of them, or you can also reach out to property owners and get a handle on it. It also funds environmental site assessments and regulatory building material surveys, which is huge for, you know, a property owner and also for a potential tenant, because, you know, a phase one could be, you know, $5,000, a phase two could be $20,000. And through these grants, it kind of absorbs some of those upfront costs, so then they can use their own money kind of towards, you know, actually cleaning up the site or doing tenant improvements and those type of things. The grant also helps pay for kind of reuse planning on the site, and then also cleanup. It doesn't pay for the cleanup, but it plans for studies and cleanup plans on it. So for Idaho Falls, we use a good portion of their grant for reuse planning and area-wide planning, like the focus area I described. So now Kerry is going to talk a little bit about the project itself.
Great, thanks, Ryan. So you can see here how we, you know, took that initial boundary that we laid out as a community, and then we broke it up into different activity centers, which you can see here. So we have a couple of commercial activity centers. There's sort of a civic activity center, middle of the map there, which is actually where the new police station that I mentioned previously is being constructed on the west side of Northgate Mile. We also are having a new opportunity there. We have some kind of historic car dealerships that are building new facilities elsewhere in the city. And so some of those properties will be becoming available, and we're going to be able to have some conversations about how that civic activity center develops. Then you also see that urban village concept, which is where kind of that historic shopping center was back in the day. That First Street corridor was where everyone went to drag Main, right? If you wanted to be seen and show off, that's where you would go, and you'd go to the shopping center there. But that hasn't been that way for a long time, and so that area really has kind of declined. So this way of breaking the area into different activity centers really spoke to the community about kind of addressing the different thoughts and ideas that we had for the differing neighborhoods. It also helped us as planners kind of address different scenarios for each. As Ryan mentioned, Northgate Mile's really kind of a highway, and First Street's more of a main street. And it really allowed us to treat these two different areas separately rather than kind of lumping them together in sort of a single address. So with that, thanks, Ryan. So then here are just some of the planning components that we talked about. And really, you know, I talked a little bit about doing that property inventory up front and some of those community and vision and engagement things that we did. Really was a huge factor in getting people out to talk to us about what they wanted to see and how to do it. And we really were able to take those thoughts and those big ideas and bring them into some community planning strategies and some implementation. And that's a real big deal, that number 5, that action plan and implementation is really huge for Idaho Falls. We really want to be held accountable. We want anything that we do to really result in actual things that get done and get built. But the community here struggled with, how are we going to fund these things? How are we going to move these things forward? And so part of this area-wide planning phase that we did was really trying to identify what are those implementation strategies that will move projects forward. And that became a real key component to the overall plan. And then, of course, the market analysis, which maybe we'll detail a little bit later, but we've done some market analysis for development in these areas so that we can take these big ideas and actually show the development community that they're workable, that it's something that can move forward. And then if we go on to the next, this is really just our engagement process and our methods. I spoke earlier in the earlier session really about that listening session and how valuable that became. Really visiting with stakeholder groups, community groups, individual property owners, and really trying to meet them at their level and where we could talk with them openly and honestly about what the project was. That also allowed us, I think, to set some expectations for the community. A lot of times we run into, citizens have big ideas. They see things that are going on in other neighborhoods in the community and they want those same things for themselves, but they don't quite understand how those things are paid for or funded or who's the actors in those things. And so this really talking to the community helped us set manageable parameters for the community so they could understand how we could move things forward. Let's go forward down to the community priorities, Ryan, thanks. So out of those engagement process came this diagram really talking about what was a priority for these neighborhoods and for this community. And this became hugely important. So you'll see some of the priorities, some of their main priorities: improved traffic and circulation in these areas, property appearance and code enforcement. Those are things that as planners alone sitting in our office without that community involved, but I don't think those would have risen to the top. They weren't on our radar when we started this area-wide planning discussion. They didn't show up until we started having those conversations and those listening conversations as major priorities. And they've really gone to sort of shaping the overall conversation and discussion as we move forward. And the other thing that we've seen too is as we take these priorities and we, rather than setting our own priorities, we take the community's priorities and move those forward. We've actually seen a lot of more involvement and property owners sort of taking ownership of some of these tasks and moving those projects forward as well, which has been huge for us as a community. You go to the next slide, Ryan. These just looking here at revitalization, adaptive reuse, and urban infill. Those are things that we're still working to try to figure out and try to streamline a little bit as a community. We've actually seen a lot of reinvestment in these areas. We've had properties, we've had people who otherwise weren't going to invest in this neighborhood, but because of these conversations, because of this plan, because they have actually purchased properties and have started to renovate those. And we're seeing success just on the open market with a lot of properties where we had kind of thought we might have to sort of push it along, provide incentives and do those other things. We really haven't. The natural market is kind of managing that. We had a property owner who had actually planned to move his business out of this corridor. But because of the discussions and because of this planning process, not only did he retain his business in the corridor, but he also purchased other properties in order to expand the business because he just felt that the city was reinvesting back into this area, and that meant that he could also have trust in reinvesting back into the neighborhood. Next slide, Ryan. Thank you. So here you see kind of our urban design plan and some of the strategies that we talked through as we talked about these areas. Strategy number one, and trying to form a district identity. That has become important, and we're still developing that. We're still trying to find those key stakeholders and those champions that will come and sort of create that identity. But we know that's important to the long run the effectiveness of this plan and really bringing it to full force. The catalyst projects have been a big part of this planning process as well. I spoke about the police station. That is certainly a catalyst project that will provide reinvestment in the area. We know that we'll see redevelopment. We know that people have already acquired property near and adjacent to the police station because they see the value that will be coming in the future. We also, in the urban village area, we've had a catalyst project already there, started with a set of townhomes that are being built. Those are going vertical now and will be occupied probably by the end of the summer, which will be bringing several more rooftops, I think 60 plus units into that neighborhood, which will just sort of reinvigorate and bring some life back to that area as well. We also have a major catalyst project at the corner of Northgate and First Street where these two corridors meet, which we're going to talk in detail later, and that's huge as well. Next slide, right? So one of the big things that we heard from the residents and property owners was about streetscape enhancements. They really felt like, you know, they had a lot of trip generation, they had a lot of cars going past their properties, but the street wasn't exactly pretty to look at, and didn't encourage sort of a walkability or what they were hoping to see. So streetscape enhancement has become a main talking point for most commercial property owners, and we're just starting to hopefully see some of those changes happen as new projects are being redeveloped. They're making a huge investment there as well. Okay, so here's kind of a closer look at that urban village catalyst project. We're also having more in-depth conversations with residents and property owners about this now. We're doing more of a site-specific plan for the area. But you can see that area around the post office where the townhomes are going in place. We've now started conversations with, we have some furniture retailers there, a bowling alley, and actually a really cool kind of 40s military building. It's multiple stories and mixed use right now, but there are a lot of cool ideas and cool concepts coming out of that for this area. And so it just all kind of comes in pieces. Again, that going back to that strategy of creating these nodes and these smaller sites that we can have more of a detailed conversation about. And then just last to kind of some interim uses that we're talking with people about. Really, it's a way to try to deal with transitions and how can we encourage reinvestment now, knowing that we'll have more permanent reinvestment in the long term. And it seems like every listening session we have, every discussion we have, food trucks come up as like a big winner for these types of areas. But what we found is that food trucks actually are kind of a catalyst unto themselves. They invigorate a space, they bring activity there and interest. And so it is actually something that's even happening naturally, but it does come up continually as something that we should do. Ryan, I'll turn it back over to you to talk about the Gateway site.
Sure. So kind of like a second. So after we finished the area-wide plan, it was like, okay, here's a vision and action plan. But then we wanted to do a little bit deeper dive on some of those designated catalyst sites. So we looked at the site that's right at kind of the entry, we call it the Gateway site, to where, you know, First Street stems off of Northgate Mile. So right now, vastly underutilized, a lot of parking lots, a lot of vacancies through there. So we worked with some of the city agencies to come up with, and also interviewed some local stakeholders on really what could go here, because the idea is if you can kind of get one little node going, then you'll see residual, you know, benefits, you know, throughout the larger corridor. So whenever we went through here, we try to balance kind of adaptive reuse with some infill potential. There's a little building right here. We came up with this option where like you improve the streetscapes through here, because placemaking is just really key to creating a place and enticing private development. So what's that?
About 1 minute.
Okay. So basically it's a mix of ground floor commercial and then putting some apartments upstairs and then some live work in the back. So Kerry, did you want to talk about kind of the next steps on this and then
Yeah, so we're actually have a developer, the building that says mixed use and apartments, we have a developer who's actually purchased that property and was actually going to work with the redevelopment agency to help fund some of that, but has actually found they can do that just on the open market and are doing it themselves. And so we're super excited. It'll be a 3-story mixed use project. We're very excited to have that come on. And then here are just some of the lessons that we've learned. And really just, I would say, small projects make a huge difference. Really don't discount the small little projects. Involve everyone, be upfront and talk about challenges early. And really talk about branding and what people love about this area, and then really create those destinations for people. And that seems to be providing us a ton of success. Listen to people, listen to the creative ideas. Big ideas really do turn into big projects.
Great. Thank you, Kerry and Ryan. Sorry, we had to kind of catch you a little bit short, but we're trying to keep it moving. And I think there was a hand raised by one of our participants, but we might save that, Sarah Wepner, if that was for a question. If we can save it to the end, that would be awesome. So next up, we have Vision to Action in Ponderay, Alex Steinberger with Cascadia, and Claire Weston with Creative Center for Land Recycling. I'll turn it over to you and I'll kind of reset the clock, and looking forward to this one. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Greg. I'll get started. I have a very small portion of this presentation. I'm actually going to be handing it over to Alex from Cascadia to go through the case study particulars, but I am the Program and Operations Manager at the Center for Creative Land Recycling. And if you want to advance to the next slide for me, Alex. I was going to talk a little bit about some of, what is a vision to action, but Kerry and Ryan and Sarah, they covered a lot of it in their case studies, which is actually great. So what I'm going to actually spend my time doing is relate what a vision to action is, which at the end of the day, it's a community engagement model. It's about involving the community to do all of the things that Kerry and Ryan and Sarah mentioned, of managing expectations, getting input from everyone, bringing in new perspectives, building trust and establishing goals between staff and residents, community groups, and for environmental justice purposes, to make sure that all voices are heard and everyone has a seat at the table. But what I'm thinking I'll do instead, rather than going over all of that, is talk a little bit about how it relates to this money that's coming down the pike. I know you heard a little bit about it, the bipartisan infrastructure law, the significant amount of money that is expected to be announced in the fall. And I wanted to say just a few things on that. And the first is that the environmental justice and sustainability, but specifically as it relates to community engagement, environmental justice is a critical component of that funding structure. And so it is absolutely paramount in starting your road to redevelopment to make sure that the community engagement is built into your redevelopment plan. And that might include planning for a vision to action, planning for that vision to action, thinking about those opportunities to engage the community is going to be really essential to accessing some of that funding that's going to be coming out. And also, to that point, because of the increase in funding that we can expect, this hasn't been announced yet, but it's highly likely that that funding will include more pre-planning activities, such as a vision to action, more community engagement type activities, and the like. So those are just 2 points that are a bit more timely and less general. So Alex, if you want to go to the next slide, let's see what I have here without being too repetitive. So yes, convening stakeholders, an opportunity to conduct a SWOT analysis, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. Generate ideas, as Sarah talked a lot about, the 3 ideas that eventually became a 4th idea. That's exactly what a vision to action is all about. And then about maintaining making sure things remain feasible, create feasible strategies for funding, planning, and implementation. That's about bringing people together and ensuring that expectations are managed. If you want to go to the next slide, Alex. Thank you. So what does a V2A look like? Oftentimes it does take the form of an in-person charrette, but what we're going to talk about today with Ponderay is actually virtual. It was conducted during sort of the height of the pandemic, and so that's what makes it somewhat interesting in part. But a vision to action can also be asynchronous with the planning process. So an active online survey or interactive map that is ongoing and allows for open communication throughout the process, a GIS analysis that is updated, that type of thing. And then next slide, Alex. And so, yes, back to this charrette method, participatory surveys, breakout groups, table exercises. A lot of that was implemented through this Ponderay case study, but virtually. So Alex is going to talk a whole lot about that. And next slide, please. And when to perform a V2A. When it's appropriate. So if you need to set some goals, some priorities, build consensus within the community. It can happen at any point in the redevelopment process. Really, it doesn't have to happen just at the very beginning. You know, community engagement should happen at the beginning, but it might be appropriate to host a vision to action smack dab in the middle of your project. So the prerequisites are really leadership support, staff commitment, always important to have a champion, and you have to be organized. So I'll close my little portion with just a note that if you think your community is ready for a vision to action, I really encourage you to reach out to the Center for Creative Land Recycling. We can assist you with that and help you pay for it, basically, in a way. So please reach out to us if you think that that is a reasonable next step for you. And I'll hand it over to Alex.
Thanks, Claire. And hi, everyone. My name is Alex Steinberger. I'm a principal with Cascadia Partners. We're based in Portland, Oregon, and we don't actually do any cleanup type activities. We are economists and land use planners and public engagement specialists. So we do a lot of work, and we've done a few of these vision to action projects with the Center for Creative Land Recycling across the country. And what we typically do is come in and talk mostly about redevelopment opportunities and engage people around what they want their vision to be for an eventual cleanup project. And so this project that we worked on in Ponderay, Idaho, was unique for us in that there's actually a very clear set of steps that the community wanted to go through to address site cleanup. In this case, the site of a historic smelter on the shore of Lake Ponderay. And if any of you saw Eric Brubaker's presentation from earlier today, he probably talked about the multi-purpose grant that they were able to secure from the EPA. So this vision to action was really timely for Ponderay because it allowed them to get a little bit of a head start on the activities in that grant, and ultimately will allow them to get a little bit more mileage out of that grant. A little bit about Ponderay, if you're not familiar with it, it's near Sandpoint, Idaho, on Lake Ponderay. And the study area for this project was a small neighborhood within Ponderay, kind of the historic core, if you can call it that, of Ponderay, between the highway and the lakeshore. And we were concerned with the smelter site, but mostly with the area surrounding it and the ultimate redevelopment of the entire area as part of this project. The smelter itself is interesting. There's not much left of what was quite a large building right there on the shore of the lake. There is a feature that locally is called black rock. That's actually a slag heap, and it's quite contaminated. And from what I understand, in the summertime, local kids do cannonballs off of it. It's not particularly safe for a number of reasons. And there's also a rail line that currently cuts off access to most of the lakeshore directly from the study area in that neighborhood in Ponderay. You can still access it from the Ponderay Bay Trail, which is a great amenity that's been built in recent years. But generally, there's not a lot of great access from the community of Ponderay today. And one of the things we wanted to look at is, what are some of the recent trends in this area? And Ponderay really lags behind a lot of other communities in terms of population growth. It has lake access, yes, but it's not safe access. It's not particularly convenient access. And so that's part of the reason why Ponderay hasn't grown quite as much as some of the surrounding communities. You can also see this here in this map in terms of some of the valuation per acre of properties along the lake. Sandpoint, of course, is a major tourist destination. Kootenai is sort of more of a vacation home destination. And in between that area circled in blue, you can see the values of property are quite low because that amenity of the lakefront is not really accessible today due to a number of reasons. And this is a growing region. It's growing really, really fast. Perhaps, we think there is potential there for Ponderay to take advantage of some of that if it's able to restore access to the lakeshore. And in the work that we do, we think a lot about amenities, urban amenities, natural amenities, transportation amenities. These all have the potential to really change the market fundamentals in an area and allow things to be built that in the past were not possible. And so this redevelopment of the smelter site and potential reconnection to the lake could really create a big change for this part of Ponderay. So as part of our work, and this is typical for work we do in a vision to action, we'll do a little bit of a market analysis. This project was happening at a very unique time. It was spring of 2020, and we all know what was happening at that time. There were a lot of projections about what was happening to the real estate market. And so we tried to cope with all those COVID shocks. Didn't quite turn out exactly as we thought. Who knew that housing would get 20% more expensive in a pandemic? But at the time we were looking at things like, what is the hotel and tourism market going to do over the next 10 years or so, and what's going to rebound first? And we also looked at affordability in Ponderay, which until now, is only starting to become something that's talked about locally, because it has been, relative to other parts of the region, somewhat more affordable. And what we found is that for owners, that's generally still the case. If you own your home, your mortgage, if you have one, is pretty small. But for renters, there aren't many options. And so the affordability issues for renters are much more severe. And this did, in fact, come up, as you'll see in some of the conversations we had with the community. So to have conversations with the community, normally we'd travel to Ponderay, we'd talk to people face to face, but again, this was spring 2020, and so we had to adapt. And so we used a tool called Maptionnaire, which allows you to do both a survey and a mapping tool to engage the community digitally. And that actually worked out really, really well and helped us, as you'll see, engage with a whole different subset of the community than typically happens. And so here you see what we got in terms of our respondent profile. 50% of the respondents were under age 54, which for a community that has a lot of retirees is pretty unusual. And that's partly because we did it online. Online engagement allows people to fit these things into their busy schedules, so you don't get just the typical attendees at events like this. In terms of what people said that they were most concerned about, we weren't entirely surprised by what we heard. There was definite desire to reconnect Ponderay to the lakeshore. That was number one, in fact. But also these issues of affordability started coming up. Keeping rent and home prices within everyone's budget was the number 3 most important issue for Ponderay going forward. So even though affordability is not largely a concern for existing residents, there's an awareness that that's becoming more acutely a problem for people. And we asked a series of questions about what sorts of development people would want to see in the study area. We asked them about single family development, multifamily, and everything in between. Not surprisingly, people are they are supportive generally of housing in their city, but less so the closer it gets to them, right? And so here we see housing getting, if it's on your street, you're much less likely to support it than if it's in your community. And that becomes more acute as you look at attached housing, and then multifamily housing. So yes, there's an awareness of an affordability problem, but like a lot of places, I don't really want it right next to me. And so that's a challenge and will be a challenge with any redevelopment that happens in this area. The tool that we used, Maptionnaire, has a really interesting feature in that you can submit comments on a map. And so we could take those comments and process them and create these really interesting heat maps to see where people in the community agreed about stuff. So this is an example map showing where people thought commercial development was most appropriate. And we did this for different kinds of residential development, different kinds of office and commercial and hotel development. So you see a housing example. And so what this allowed us to do is to start to parse out where different focus areas for growth could be within the study area. And so we started developing as different concept areas or nodes for downtown development or housing development or commercial development. And from there, we started to develop rough scenario concepts, different ways that this area could transition over time, and developed 3 scenarios that were named with different names that were familiar to people locally. And then we used a tool that I and other folks at Cascadia Partners have developed over the years called Envision Tomorrow. It's a scenario planning tool that uses real estate pro forma to actually measure the impacts of development. And so we use this tool to take those very rough scenario concepts and turn them into actual parcel-based land use scenarios. And so we did that for the 3 focus areas and measured the amount of new jobs and square footage of development, and also tested the feasibility of those projects in each scenario. Here you can see an example of how we took 3 concept areas for downtown commercial and housing and translated those into an actual parcel-based scenario showing where the physical change would happen in the development scenario. And then the tool is able to report a bunch of interesting indicators across a range of different categories that people tend to care about. Housing mix is one, showing the different unit types that would exist in each development scenario. Cost of housing, because we know that affordability is an issue. The amount of new infrastructure that would be needed to serve that development in each scenario. And we took all of this information and we packaged it up into a series of posters because by the time we were finished, it was sort of the end of the summer of 2020. If you all remember, things were getting a little bit more comfortable. We kind of knew what COVID was, and Ponderay has this great event every year in the late summer called Neighbor Day, and they get everybody together in this exact study area, which is really cool. And it was a great opportunity to take the work that we did and actually get people to do things the old-fashioned way. Dots, pens, and that sort of stuff. And so we got some great input on these different scenarios, and we're looking forward to seeing what comes out of them as this multi-purpose grant moves forward. As I mentioned, this vision to action came as a super helpful time for Ponderay because they have this really detailed work plan and they have funding to complete it. And with this vision to action project, they got to knock out a few of those requirements in the work plan without even spending a dime of the multi-purpose grant money. So it allows that funding to go even further. This is just a graphic that we put together while we were doing the project, showing what we thought was completed in process or still needed to be done within the area-wide planning task of their multi-purpose grant. So we're hopeful that this is a helpful guide to them moving forward so that they don't have to redo any of that work and they can save those scarce dollars for the stuff that really matters, cleaning up the site and prepping it for reuse going forward. So I'll stop there a couple minutes ahead of 20 minutes and just say thank you to both the Center for Creative Land Recycling, City of Ponderay, obviously Idaho DEQ, and others who are part of this project. And we are here to answer questions at the end of the presentations if there are any. So with that, I'll hand it back to Greg.
Thank you, Alex and Claire. I really appreciate that detailed analysis. Kind of a really another take on that region. Very, very interesting. I've been looking at real estate in there for years, and it's like, wow, what I should have done 2 or 3 years ago. Okay, next up, the story of Bayhorse. So Sarah Wepner, are you, there you are.
Here I
Okay.
am.
And then just while Sarah's getting her presentation prepared, if everyone looks at the chat window, there are some resources being posted from CCLAIR, from Idaho DEQ, from EPA. There's other resources that people are posting in some comments. So you might want to just track that. There's no questions yet for after the fact, but some good information there being dropped in there. And again, I will collect these presentations at the end of this conference, and then I will have it available for all the attendees. And I'll save them in a PDF format so they're easy to open and easy to access. So with that, it's all you, Sarah.
Okay, let me make sure I just got training on this today, last minute. Everybody can see my presentation, is that correct?
Not yet.
Okay, hold on there. All right, here we go. This should be it. How's that look?
And it looks like it's going to start. Yep, looks perfect now. Thank you.
Great. Okay, well, thank you so much. I'm really excited to be presenting for the Idaho Brownfields Conference. My name is Sarah Wepner. I'm the division manager for the environmental division here at Alta Science and Engineering. And Derek Forseth was actually the presenter for this topic, but he had a family emergency that he found out about this morning. So he is on a plane to Colorado at the moment, and luckily he had some slides put together and he sent them my way. But I'm really excited to tell you about this unique Brownfields cleanup. It's this transformation of a historic ghost town into a state park in a really incredible part of Idaho. It's located near Chalice, Idaho. It's the Bayhorse State Park is made up of 4 mine sites that were cleaned up as part of a Brownfields grant. And they include the Bayhorse town site, the Beardsley Excelsior mine, the Pacific mine, and the Skylark Ramshorn. And the Bayhorse town site itself is sort of the central jumping off point to this larger historic state park, whereas the Skylark and Pacific and Beardsley are all up in they're local. They're kind of group named as the upper mines because they're far up a very steep slope that you can access through Forest Service trails. But the area around Bayhorse is beautiful, and the history itself, the mining history and its impact on the state of Idaho is also really fascinating. And this is the park as it looks today. It was designed to accommodate a number of different types of users, in particular ATV and motorcycle enthusiasts who utilize hundreds of miles of trails within the Bayhorse mining district to access adits and prospector camps and a number of different very interesting features throughout this area. It also was built to accommodate visitors who are interested in seeing the historic ghost town of Bayhorse. There's still a number of buildings standing at the site, and they're fascinating. We wanted to make sure that there was a safe and accessible way for families to come walk throughout the site, maybe campers who are on their way to the upper Bayhorse lakes. There's 2, and a big Bayhorse and little Bayhorse Lake. So, it had to have kind of multiple functions for different recreational users. And if you enter into the site, you'll notice that there's a number of artifacts that were used in the milling and smelting process at the town site. And these were basically during the cleanup pulled out of large junk piles and set aside so that they could be placed throughout the state park as educational pieces. And there's also numerous historic buildings. The building in the upper left-hand corner is the mill, and it's a 30 stamp mill that was operational in the mid to early 1800s. And the lower corner, you'll see the Wells Fargo building. And this is probably, in my opinion, the coolest building on the property. It is highly fortified, the only brick building. It has iron doors, and it was basically where all of the processed ore was stored to protect against, I guess, raiders or robbers. And then throughout the site, you'll see a number of signs that talk about the history, so that there's an opportunity there for visitors to learn more about the site before cleanup and about the town site and surrounding area. Outside of the town site, there's just a number of features that are, again, of interest. There's adits throughout the district. The adit shown here is dubbed the Icebox Adit, and it's up by the Skylark mine, which I'll show you a picture of later. And it is called the Icebox Adit because if you stand in front of it on a hot July day, you get a blast of like beautifully cold air coming out from the middle of the mountain. There's I mentioned Big Bayhorse Lake. This picture in the upper right is a picture of the lake, and they stock this lake with trout and have, I think a dozen campsites. It's a rough road to get there, but absolutely worth it and very, very serene. I was there with my family this past summer, and it kind of felt like we were the only people there. So, and then near the town site, there's some charcoal kilns that were used to produce charcoal from timber harvested from the forest nearby. And then that charcoal was used to power the smelter at the town site. So there's just a lot of interesting and beautiful views to see while you're out in this area. This is the Skylark mine, and you can access this mine by ATV. I wouldn't recommend a truck. You could also walk. It's a bit of a haul, or by mountain bike if you're really hardy. But then you can walk out on this walking path to the Skylark mine and have these incredible views. So the history of the town site itself is interesting as well. It was named Bayhorse because a prospector who was out looking to stake a claim lost track of his horse. And when he found him, he also found Bayhorse Mine, and hence it was a Bayhorse. So he named his claim Bayhorse Mine. And the town site itself was upwards of 300 people at its peak. They had a hotel, a dance hall, the smelter, the mill. They had residences for not just miners, but also their spouses, their wives, and their children. And at its largest, at one point in time, it was one of the largest cities, or I should say towns, in Idaho. So it was a pretty bustling community in the 1800s. And the Bayhorse mining district was really prosperous. There was, at the mill, I believe, produced, and the smelter produced up to, in today's dollars, about $280 million worth of silver. So it was quite successful and has a very strong place in Idaho history. So how did we get from this to and this was pre-cleanup, pre-assessment and pre-cleanup. How did we get from Bayhorse of the past to Bayhorse State Park today? Well, it started with a gentleman who was on the Idaho State Parks and Recreation Board, and he happened to be kind of an amateur historian, and he loved to go visit these ghost towns throughout Idaho. And so he really just started talking to people about the fact that this town site, Bayhorse, and then the surrounding upper mines would be a great place to build a park. And he really didn't stop talking until people started to listen. But there are some things that needed to happen before that vision was achieved, because of its long history of smelting and milling of ore. The town site had very high levels of lead and arsenic in the soils, along with processing waste such as tailings and slag. And this just shows a map of lead concentrations, but throughout the town site. But they were in upwards of, the tens of thousands of parts per million, extremely high levels of lead. There was also an unstable slag pile that was right up against Bayhorse Creek, which runs kind of through the heart of the town site, that needed to be graded and stabilized and capped. And there was a large slag or tailings pile. At one point in time, this tailings pile had a volleyball net and a barbecue pit on it because the Bayhorse town site caretaker decided he was going to use it as his own beachfront property. So this slag pile was quite large and also unstable and very close to Bayhorse Creek. So all of these things needed to be addressed. In addition, there are numerous trails and roads and areas that had high lead and arsenic concentrations in the soil that needed to be cleaned up so that visitors at the park could safely access them. So they could travel through the park and they could view the existing historical buildings. So that brings us to Brownfields cleanup. The Department of Parks and Recreation, they purchased the site. So they were the owner and they were working with Department of Environmental Quality to do the initial assessment, site characterization. And from there, they were able to secure 3 Brownfields cleanup grants, 1 for the town site and 2 for the upper mines, and then work with their neighboring landowners, including the Forest Service and Bureau of Land Management, to address some other areas nearby the town site that were off their property, but also had issues with historic mining contamination. So they entered into the Brownfields process. They joined the voluntary cleanup program through DEQ, developed a cleanup plan, followed by a detailed work plan of how the cleanup would occur. They put that through the public comment process and went to cleanup and eventually closure. And the closure report included operations and maintenance and institutional control plans in order to ensure that the cleanup remained in place and protective of park visitors. And the interesting thing, while looking into this, putting together this presentation, Derek pulled up a number of still what I would call public comments in Pinterest, TripAdvisor, and YouTube. So, never underestimate the value of good and clear public input and buy-in for your cleanup, because even to this day, and it's been, I want to say 15 years since that initial public comment period, there's still people who are commenting on Bayhorse and the cleanup and the town site. These are just some elements of the cleanup. We needed to move a very small, not very strong existing bridge, put in a new bridge over Bayhorse Creek to allow for trucks with large trailers, pulling ATVs, et cetera, to access the parking lot. The slag pile, which is now the parking lot, needed to be regraded, cleaned up, and covered. And it actually was used as a repository for some additional soils that were removed from the town site. And the tailings pile needed to be regraded and covered as well. And one of the things that was really important to Parks and Rec is that we maintain the historic feel of the town site. And so they didn't want to, they wanted to retain the view of the tailings pile as it is. And so we actually designed a cover that looked like the tailings pile when it was all said and done. And that offered the opportunity for Parks and Rec to talk about the history and talk about the process of milling and the waste from that milling process as well. Our approach was a risk-based cleanup. We looked at the future use, knew that it was going to be utilized for recreational uses, and then developed cleanup goals and cleanup standards based on those recreational uses. So we were able to not over-engineer the cleanup, and in some cases save some money in terms of costs for soil removals and that type of thing. So the cleanup also included, as I mentioned before, a tailings pile regrade and a cover slag pile. We turned the slag pile to some degree into a repository where we were able to bring additional waste and then stabilize that and cover it. There was a bridge that was installed, and then a system of clean trails so that people could walk through the site and view these historic buildings. And of course, local stormwater controls to protect the remedy into the long term. And so after the cleanup, this is actually a picture I took. I brought my husband and my 2 sons to the town site this last summer so that they could see what mom does for work. I had spent, as many of you probably did, several months with my sons in the other room listening to me on the phone, and they thought, well, is that all you do is talk on the phone for work? During COVID, when they were at school and I was at work and we were all in the same general space. And so I thought it was important for them to see really, what was the work that I did. And so we visited the town site, and here's kind of as just an example of the trail system leading up to the mill building. And then this is the front of the mill building. So you can see people can get really quite close up to those historic buildings that are currently in a state of arrested decay, as we like to say. This is the Wells Fargo building before and after the cleanup. As you can see, there were large piles of slag that were removed. And then again, the clean trail system, so that they could, at some point in time, I believe, Parks and Rec would like to have people be able to access this building. They're not there yet, but while we were there this summer, they were replacing the roof. So they are working to make sure it's stable. And maybe sometime in the near future, you'll be able to walk into that building. And there you have it. And I really, one other thing, I guess I should not forget this. This was a great example of partnership and cooperation. There were numerous stakeholders involved and numerous landowners and agencies. And so the cleanup project was awarded from the Department of Interior, the Partners in Conservation Award for great efforts in conservation that involved cooperation and partnership. And thank you so much. And I'm sure Derek would have loved to have been here. And I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to everybody. Thanks again.
Great. Thank you, Sarah. Now I've got another place to go visit on my my bucket list. So appreciate the insights on that. Looks like a great new addition to state park system.
Yeah.
So with that, we're coming up on, I guess, the closing session of the case studies, and we'll have some time for Q&A afterwards. So everybody that's on, still stick around. And then it looks like some questions are starting to come online. So we'll get to those after Seth's presentation. So reclaiming the waterfront. So Seth, you get 20 minutes. I'll let you take it from here.
Thanks, Greg. Let me just make sure I can share my screen appropriately here. So let me know if it's coming up. Is it showing?
Not yet.
Okay. Bear with me here.
This is free time, so you're okay.
Yeah, I get the balance, right? Isn't that what we agreed on? Sorry, I did not get the training, so I apologize in advance for being inept in this regard here.
It should function with that share screen below at the bottom.
Yeah, the problem is that it's not sharing it in slide form, it's sharing it in the outline format. It's not sharing it in the slideshow format. Does that make sense? Let me try
Yeah.
it this way.
I'm not seeing either share. Do you want to share and then wait? I'm starting to see something coming up.
What are you seeing?
Blank blue screen. Must
Blank
be
blue screen.
on monitors.
How's that?
That looks perfect there.
Okay.
That's in
Great.
present view as well.
All right. Let me move this out of the way. How's that?
Looks good.
Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you. Apologies for the little technical glitch there at the beginning. Very much appreciate being included on the agenda here and appreciate everyone who's stuck it out through the end. Thank you. I acknowledge I'm the last speaker here, so I'll try to keep it within the time and keep it interesting as well. I'm focusing on sharing some case studies from around the Pacific Northwest and focusing on photos and videos, and definitely welcome any questions at the end of this. Again, thank you to Greg and the NEBC team on pulling this conference together. Thank you to the sponsors and the attendees, and really enjoyed all the speakers so far in this case study session. Let's see, let's advance. Okay, so my name is Seth Otto. I am a principal planner with the consulting firm Maul, Foster & Alongi, or MFA. We are a multidisciplinary integrated environmental and engineering consulting firm. We have planners, GIS specialists, engineers and scientists, communications specialists, and we focus on challenging environmental conditions and delivering redevelopment projects for communities, again, around the Pacific Northwest. I'm based in Portland, Oregon, but I work around the region, and I married into a large Sandpoint family, so I'm in North Idaho quite often, and pretty familiar with the region, and as well as a lot of Idaho. In my career at MFA and working on brownfields, I've had the opportunity to see many great and interesting projects of multiple scales. And the ones that have really stood out to me is particularly, I think, impactful and that have allowed communities to achieve their maximum potential, often involve engaging with their waterfronts, whether it's a river, a lake, the ocean in a few cases. And it really is a matter of communities recognizing one of their greatest amenities and assets, something that many of our Northwest communities have actually turned their back on over the course of development, and recognizing the value and the huge amenity embodied in waterfront redevelopment is quite significant, and particularly when it involves brownfield cleanup, removing risk and liability and exposure threats to our human and environmental health. So I'm going to run through some case studies where we've worked on brownfield waterfront redevelopment. But before I do that, provide a little bit of context and background. Of course, in the Pacific Northwest, especially in the inland Northwest, we recognize the importance of water, the connection to water, and the importance of waterways is critical to survival. The first residents of the Northwest recognized our abundance coming from water. They developed a rich culture based around fishing and developing habitation around rivers and waterways. Their culture developed a reverence for salmon and other species endemic to our waterways. European settlers as well recognized the great potential and the abundance of waterways in the inland Pacific Northwest, using them for transportation, for movement of goods and services, as well as locations for their growing communities. We developed and recognized the richness and abundance of the natural resources in this region, utilized waterways, again, to access deeper and less accessible areas within the topography of the Pacific Northwest, utilizing rivers and waterways to move goods for critical infrastructure as well. As you can see here, there's some very critical infrastructure happening here in the middle of this mining community, as well as the ability to access this deep river valley following the waterway. Over time, we developed infrastructure that further got us in proximity to the waterfront, utilizing it again for transportation, for development of energy, for movement of goods and services, and recognizing the urban and economic potential of our communities, growing in and around these critical waterways and growing our industry in concert, developing industrial uses that had sometimes very large footprints and often took advantage of their close proximity to these waterfronts for storage of materials. Again, the land along waterways during this period was often undervalued as a result of the proximity of industrial uses, and our communities grew away from them and abandoned our waterfronts as key assets and amenities. Over the last several decades, as resource extraction economies have changed and evolved, we've reconsidered our relationship with our waterways in the Pacific Northwest, recognizing them as real amenities, places where we can help achieve the quality of life that we aspire to, redeveloping them from industrial blight into rich and accessible open spaces where the public can once again re-engage with our waterfront and with each other, and often find that these redevelopments catalyze growth and other ancillary benefits around our communities. So I'm going to share a few examples, again, from around the region where I've had the opportunity to work on a few projects that have seen this catalytic growth and have taken advantage and are continuing to take advantage of their access to the waterfront to realize great public benefit. So the first case study here is in Seattle. This is Portage Bay. Many of you may be familiar with Portage Bay as a waterway that connects Lake Union to Lake Washington via the Montlake Cut. It's also a formerly industrial area. Many of you may think of it as a place where there's a lot of houseboats, but it has historically been a very densely developed industrial waterway. And that legacy remains and is being addressed through really pointed brownfield redevelopment and active engagement from the various different bureaus within the city of Seattle. Let's see. So this is the Seattle Parks and Rec project, where they're redeveloping this former industrial site into the Fritz Hedges Waterway Park. It's a 1.65 acre property, was formerly occupied by a sawmill and a manufacturing plant. Redevelopment of the site into a public park required addressing legacy contamination issues, which presented a myriad of engineering and ecological challenges. So we led site characterization, remediation, design, and engineering efforts in partnership with our the design lead, Walker Macy, and the landscape architectural firm out of Portland and Seattle. So in situ bioremediation began in 2016 with full site remedial action and construction beginning in 2017. The park opened shortly thereafter and has been in full use since 2017. Oops, next slide. So integrating the remediation with the design was critical to achieving the project objectives here and allowing for a smooth redevelopment of this park project. There are quite a few contaminants of concern, including chlorinated solvents, metals, petroleum, and PCBs as well, and sediment. And so we had a fairly integrated process and extensive site cleanup and redevelopment. Our partners, Walker Macy, really recognizing the constraints of the site, incorporated the remediation into the design and reconfiguration of the future park into a quite simple and elegant design, I think, recognizing a renewed topography here that resembles the pre-development state, acknowledging the topography quite literally with the benches that they constructed that look like lines on a topo map, and incorporating in some very striking modern elements such as this pier that juts out into the Portage Bay and has been designed to allow for light filtration so that it is not impactful of the aquatic habitat. The site is used quite heavily by people from Seattle and around the area, people of all ages and abilities, accessing the site in many different ways and just enjoying the space, reconnecting with the waterfront, touching the gravel and the soil, touching the water in a very urban area where access to water is sometimes quite scarce, despite the fact that it's completely surrounded by water. Next example is in Eugene on the Willamette River. This is the former Eugene Water and Electric Board property, or EWEB. EWEB's the one of the largest customer-owned utilities in Oregon, provides power and water to Eugene and the surrounding urban area. This site had been its primary power generating facility within Eugene. There was a steam plant, as well as, what you don't see here, is a former manufactured gas plant, which was, as many of you know, quite a dicey situation. And so this site had been fenced off and closing not only the property to downtown Eugene, but also the waterfront, which had been fenced off, creating a disconnect of its riverfront bike and pedestrian trail along the river. Starting within the last decade, the city of Eugene recognized the potential of this site to re-engage and reclaim the waterfront, and they've embarked on a very ambitious design and development process to bring the Greenway Trail through, to bring in extensive public amenities, and then to provide for upland development. The Greenway in this way is catalyzing interest and mobilizing developers to bring new mixed-use communities into this section of the waterfront in Eugene. MFA worked on this property in two capacities, developing the cleaning up the MGP property, which consisted of removing and containing mobile liquid and contaminated soils associated with that previous use, capping and containing other on-site contaminations associated with historic environmental contamination, and then also working on riverbank stabilization to prevent long-term release of on-site contaminations into the Willamette River, and to help restore habitat along this section of the Willamette River. Let's see, I think we also have a video here. The bank stabilization design, which involved quite an extensive permitting process, as you might imagine, with multiple jurisdictions, has been designed to ensure resilience under future potential changed climate conditions. And we evaluated potential for the 100-year flood design conditions to change. And so that's been built into the design, much of which is yet to be implemented, but is permitted and will really transform this waterfront area. The city of Eugene now is busy with construction of the site facilities, the site features. Again, very open and forward-looking design, and with the intent that this becomes a regional amenity, a draw for people from around the Pacific Northwest, as Eugene positions itself as a growing and active community in both economically and culturally. The last example I have here, down the Willamette River, just past the confluence with the Columbia River, is the community of St. Helens, another former logging community based on its proximity to Portland and to the large ports up and down the river, had long been known as a place for large pulp and paper and plywood veneer mills. Those mills started closing in the late 90s, and by the early 2000s, the sites were cleared, and the legacy of this industrial operation remained, cutting, again, as you can see, the community off from their connection to the waterfront, leaving sort of a disconnected downtown Main Street in the upper right of the screen, you can see there, and a large area of underutilized and blighted property right along an area that should be the city's greatest asset. And recognizing that, the city really rolled up their sleeves and got engaged in a visioning and design process with broad swath of the community as they could, through multiple community engagement efforts and events. They asked people to reimagine their waterfront. What did they want their community to be as they moved away from a mill town into something that more resembles a modern and forward-looking community along the Columbia River? What kind of development, what kind of engagement with the river did they want to see? What kind of asset did they want to build for their community to attract new residents and businesses to push economic development in their community? This framework planning process considered multiple different options for development, but focused primarily on providing areas for development and anticipating the infrastructure that would be needed to catalyze this development. And since then, the city has been focused on obtaining funding and financing to construct the roadways and the riverfront greenway, similar to what the city of Eugene did, in order to incentivize and attract private development. They're in the process right now of negotiating a development agreement with at least one party for part of the mixed use development anticipated here on the waterfront. The city went through a visioning process that imagined a vibrant, mixed use and engaged waterfront facing development that turned this liability of a former industrial blight on their waterfront into a true asset and puts St. Helens on the map regionally as a place to locate, to bring a business, to live, play, stay, and grow community. The community itself is very engaged in this process and has been very forward about promoting the opportunities. And in fact, I have a short video that they've put together and have asked me to play here, just so you can see the excitement that the city of St. Helens brings to brownfield redevelopment and the potential that waterfront projects have for catalyzing the growth. So I'm going to close out here with this video from the city of St. Helens, and I think we'll return for closeout.
St. Helens has been a mill town, has a reputation for a mill town. It was known as the paycheck city, where people would come all over to come get their paycheck and work on the mill. That industry changed, it went away, and it's been sitting here underutilized for at least the last 20 years. The city actively went to pursue the property and acquire it and ensure its future for a positive outcome that benefited the public interest.
The projects at St. Helens Waterfront are complex and transformative and provides the opportunity for the community to reimagine how it interacts with the river.
We made use of the community about 5 years ago. The most important thing we heard from them was that public access to the water was what they wanted to see on the site. And so the Riverwalk presents that opportunity to do just that. We want to design public access for people to get to and view the river.
This particular project is so critical for our city because it's the future. This is where we're going to connect the city with a brand new waterfront and Riverwalk project that's going to bring the community together to enjoy the amenities and the nature we have here in the city. So infrastructure really plays the role of a substructure for any potential future project.
The super waterfront happens to be a wastewater treatment plant. This is a more regulated site, and it's a little bit complex to become for the property.
We do a lot of work with Brownfields development because it brings together both the environmental concerns as well as the economic and community development opportunities.
This is what you call the missing piece of the puzzle. So once you have that in place, you have that connectivity that extends from the Riverwalk, Central Waterfront, all the way to the industrial business.
Around the same time that the city purchased the veneer site, they also made the decision to purchase the former mill site. The goal was to diversify the industrial economy of St. Helens. We hope to have multiple light manufacturing users and other industrial users on the site. By getting multiple industrial users, we don't have all of our eggs in one basket and we can be a more resilient economy.
This is sort of how we do community and economic development in Oregon. We are a very collaborative state.
No better place than St. Helens.
All right. Well, thank you very much again for sticking out and for your attention. I hope that I've been able to communicate here again the great power of waterfront redevelopment for catalyzing public benefit in communities, particularly when there's brownfield cleanup and remediation involved. Certainly have been very honored to have worked with these communities on helping them to realize their great potential. I think we're going to wrap up here, Greg, so maybe I'll hand it back to you and we can field some questions.
Great. Thank you, Seth. You know, and this is a good time for questions. We probably have about 15 minutes for questions if we have questions. And I think everybody can maybe see the chat. There's more conversation going on there. I'm not sure if there's any specific questions, if anybody wants to look and kind of jump in. But you can really see, based on this collection of case studies, the diversity of brownfields, redevelopment projects, and the impact of the various communities throughout Idaho, and even some of those outside of Idaho that Seth touched on. So any questions for the participants? And any questions? I know, Sarah Wepner, you had your hand up earlier, and I didn't know if that was a question for someone else that was presenting at the time, but certainly happy to field a question among the participants and make this a little bit more interactive. Sarah? Oh, and you're on mute, Sarah, sorry.
I apologize. I accidentally had raised my hand when I was trying to look at the chat bar. You know, all of these presentations have been great and so broad and diverse. But at this point, I don't have a question.
Okay, looks like we have one question here. Let's see, from Tiffany. Tiffany Allgood. How do you protect water quality during flood events or sewer failures, et cetera, when the areas are redeveloped? Tiffany, I don't know if this was for someone specific. It's directed at Seth because of the—
Sure, I can take a stab at it. You know, and with full disclosure that I'm not an engineer, and two, as a result, I'm not intimately engaged in remedial design, particularly or with flood management. But I would say that if you are in an area that is susceptible to flood, or let's say this hypothetical is in an area that's susceptible to flooding, that needs to be incorporated into the design. So it's a major design flaw to leave contamination in a floodplain or floodway that would be susceptible to periodic flooding. I think that's kind of a general prerequisite.
And Tiffany did state that, yeah, the question's for anyone or everyone. So, and those of you that don't have your camera on, if you want to have it on, great. If not, you want to answer away, feel free to just jump in and I'll.
I would just add, Greg, that I think this is a really good question, Tiffany, and I think this is particularly relevant as people consider the impact of more frequent and more severe storms on brownfield sites. So I think building on what Seth said, I would just offer that with the caveat that I too am not an engineer, I am really interested in how people are thinking about future-proofing different remediation designs and redevelopment designs for more severe weather. And I know that there's been some research recently coming out of the Superfund program at EPA. We don't have a ton of data, but EPA a couple of years ago did a survey of how various Superfund sites that were in different stages of cleanup and redevelopment held up in the southeastern Puerto Rico during the devastating 2017 hurricanes. Anyway, it's available. You can easily Google it up. But I think that this is a really good question. And I think it's something that we're going to be continuing to, our approach will continue to evolve as we move forward and venture that. So.
Thank you, Sarah. John.
Yeah, I might just add to that too, that there's been a lot of focus on remedy protection in the Silver Valley. And so a lot of the infrastructure work that's just been wrapping up in the city of Kellogg and some other places like that are very focused on directing water away from contamination and protecting it that way. So there's a lot of cool things that have been done up there, Tiffany, that you might want to check out.
Another question here from Timothy Kramer. Has there been any work in dealing with reclamation of mines or the like where the long-term pH of water quality of the streams have been affected? What was done to restore water quality to support regrowth of both wildlife and plant life? Any takers?
I'm guessing there are probably other people in the audience. I don't know, Greg, if they can join. I guarantee you there's someone in the participant list who has an answer to that.
I've not tried it, but I certainly could if there was somebody that said, hey, me. In fact, if Steve Gill is still on, I might try to see if I would just like to, see if he's still out there. Steve, are you able to allow to talk? How about that, Steve? Or I can promote you to a panelist. Hope you don't mind, Steve. I'll ask him to unmute. Any other questions or any other comments kind of in closing too? If anybody says, gosh, I saw and heard something from a colleague, I really wish I would have mentioned this as it relates to my own presentation. Anything else from anyone?
Well, on the mine issue, I mean, we have numerous mines, Silver Valley to the phosphate mines throughout the whole state, and water quality is something we've worked jointly on a lot of projects. We've done a lot of reclamation projects. I mean, clear up to the Canadian border, the Continental Mine, where we would have a consortium of agencies. None of these were brownfield projects. These were all sort of those large general remediation of mine sites like the Continental Mine and I mean, all of these. And so there's a water quality component, and we work with our sister agencies, in the state, Fish and Game and Department of Lands, but we also work with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, or BLM. Bayhorse was Idaho Department Park and Rec, and then John or Sarah, you might correct me, was BLM property adjacent to that, or Forest Service?
That was Forest Service, I believe.
Right. So
right adjacent.
Right. So we have these projects, and generally it becomes the water quality component always there. I mean, we're all looking at that, and sometimes we'll work up long-term monitoring where we come back to a site once every 5 years, and we do a look at the stream and stuff. I'm working in the city of Plummer. I'm not actually leading this up, but it's through EPA's. We had a targeted brownfields assessment of an old property and worked with Tiffany with the Coeur d'Alene tribe and the city of Plummer on that project for the last 13 years of my life. Finally doing a cleanup this year with EPA's through their critical removal program. And one of the things that came up as we were planning this in May, we're going to see some long-term stream monitoring to just make sure that those pHs and some of the other VOCs that we detected in the soils aren't getting into the little Plummer Creek that runs right adjacent to that. So I get that's a long-winded answer, but yes, water quality and mines are a huge, that's why. I mean, I should have dug out my old picture, and I probably have it. I could find it, but I'm not going to. But I have in the early 1970s of the North Fork of the Coeur d'Alene River running right through Kellogg, and it is just a murky gray due to the high zinc content. It's running, and you look at that stream today and you can see through it. So that's an improvement in my lifetime.
Just want to flag up, there is a response in the chat there to the question.
Yeah, are you able to see that and distill with the?
Sure. In terms of mine sites in the Silver Valley, we do see impacts of pH, and the process of ameliorating that is tied to various RA efforts, including hauling material away from the site to repositories and rerouting water. That's, yeah.
Yep.
And as a local, I'd note family members indicating that as well. That must be the color of the water, right? Yeah.
Right, yeah.
Another question here from Valerie Wade regarding the Atlas Mill project. Is there any communication with the folks working on the Bunker Hill Superfund site regarding recontamination along the new public beach?
So that's a good question. And that's one of the things when we had, so that project, we had both Alta Science and Engineering and Tetra Tech work on that project on different portions of it. We did assessment work on that project from the year 2015. And we're continuing to do assessment right now as they move the 400,000 cubic yard wood waste and soil pile from what's called Mount Hink to ITD's pit over by on Ramsey. So I'm still sampling that site, but along the river, so that's a losing reach, the Spokane River. So it wasn't like what was on the site was getting into the river. The river's actually flowing under the site. Groundwater level on the site to the Rutherford Prairie Aquifer at that point is about 175 feet down. So one of the things we were concerned about, though, is the sediments and the banks. And now if you look at the Atlas Mill site today versus what it was, those banks were we've reworked them totally compared to almost back to what we think was the native slope of that stream. So we collected sediment samples, and we also collected bank samples. And so we used geoprobes coming in to the top of the bank, and then we used regular hand augers with crews that were going out into the water. And we were trying to correlate our depths, and we did that all along that the entire front of that property before they started any of the stabilization. The city beach is a dog park, the kayaks and all of that. And we didn't find any impacts. I mean, we were looking, we were expecting that we might find impacts, but I think that because the mills through the years reworked that so much. I mean, that site where there used to be a beach was in a huge bank and then a huge ditch, and there were loading areas, there were chutes for the old timbers and logs. So that site had been reworked so much, we didn't see those historic levels we were expecting. And all that data is there. It's posted on the City of Coeur d'Alene's website, all of our phase 2 work, our supplemental work. And we're, like you say, we're continuing to do more work today. So and in fact, just as an interesting coincidence, I tied into Oregon DEQ to kind of coordinate how we were going to sample the wood waste for protection of groundwater, because we wanted something that we weren't just inventing the sampling regime with our contractor Tetra Tech, but that we were actually coming in and using something that was done before. And so we worked with Mary Kalamata with Oregon DEQ. Thank her very much. And we've got that sampling going now. So, and really to that point, that's one thing that's really cool about Brownfields from a state regulator standpoint, is I have no qualms about calling somebody in Washington or Alaska, or if I know them, they're in Virginia, and just asking questions, because it's different where we're not enforcing, we're not trying to follow a state statute. We've sort of got this open regulatory book, and Idaho we don't have our own really a CERCLA program within the state of Idaho, so we don't have our own numbers. We're using EPA's RSLs, and it really helps us to work with other states. So I do that often, and for years we've been working with the folks in Spokane with ecology, and we used to get together on a quarterly basis pre-COVID, and now we're planning to start doing that again. So it just helps us to communicate. So and that's really what earlier in the day with Joelle, her whole idea of the peer group. So DEQ isn't involved. nor is EPA, but it allows Joelle to come in and work with the folks that are grantees or interested potential grantees and talk about that. And it's some of the stuff that she brings to the table.
Good. Thank you,
And I-
Steve, for letting
and
me
I see-
just jump in.
I see Valerie said, thank you. Glad you hear you're monitoring it. So yes.
Any other, we're kind of at time, but we certainly have time for any other questions. Any other questions from the audience or any closing thoughts from any panelists that have been able to remain on here for the last few minutes? You know, I want to say, I looked here at the screen who's remaining, and it's Alta, Maul, Alongi, and Stantec, and they were all, and Steve Gill with Idaho DEQ. And this was actually the first cluster of individuals. I said, hey, we're thinking about doing this. What do you think? There's been talk about it. And they were all the first to step up and say, yes, let's do it. And, you know, we were planning this over a year ago, and for various speed bumps and new hires and people moving on to other career opportunities, we said, you know what, let's just wait until the timing's right. Now it felt like the timing was good in 2022. So maybe the next time we do this, we'll actually be in person, which would be a really a good thing.
Yeah, fall 2023, and we'll do it at Coeur d'Alene, and I'll get everybody out on one of the big boats on the lake. So
I'm in. I like that.
yeah, we'll do it. Yeah, and I think the state office, Boise, they want to come up here too for that. So it would be a good time. We could actually jump into Washington and look at sites there. We can go to the Silver Valley. We got it all. Plus it'd be, you know, mid-September would be beautiful.
Yeah. Excellent.
Yeah.
Okay. With that, everybody, thanks for joining. Again, I'll get some follow-up information about the PowerPoints as PDF. So for those of you that are remaining, send those to me or to Jennifer, and then we'll get a link out to the videos as well, since everything has been recorded. So with that, thank you. I think we got a little bit of time left in the day, and have a great day.
Okay. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Greg. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.